Hi, you're watching Hockey Analytics with Timo. Today, I want to talk about time on ice and player shifts, which make up time on ice, and the changes that you might not have noticed that have happened over the last several years at the NHL, uh, based on data from puck and player tracking. So, time on ice started to be tracked at the NHL in the 1997-98 season. Before then, a lot of stats that are familiar in the current box scores, like face-off percentage, giveaways, takeaways, block shots, hits, they didn't exist before then. So if you look at career stats for, let's say, Wayne Gretzky, until his last two seasons, he doesn't have a face-off percentage. So what was done when these stats started being collected? The NHL put a team of off-ice officials in every arena. So sitting typically at the press box level, you'd have about a half a dozen or so off-ice officials who would be tracking these stats. So one person tracking the time on ice and the shifts for one team, another one tracking the time on ice for the other team, let's say the away team, official or two tracking the shots for the two teams, and other officials tracking the hits and giveaways and takeaways and so on. And then there would be a boss of the crew who would make sure that everything was running smoothly, perhaps make some corrections and changes. So that's the way the NHL has run ever since then. But that started to change. So, first of all, what were some of the issues with having off-ice officials collecting those stats? Now, one that's pretty well known in the analytics community is one that's called arena biases. So if a certain crew tended to mark down more giveaways or takeaways, or maybe they tended to mark down more takeaways only for the home team, or whatever, that would skew those stats for a player. So I've one of the examples I've frequently brought up is in an era when there weren't a lot of stats, weren't any fancy stats to look at. If sports writers were voting on the Selke Trophy, they might be looking at blocked shots or takeaways. So if you happen to be in an arena that was counted high or low takeaways, that might have made a big difference towards whether you won the Selke Trophy or not. But we're talking about time on ice here mainly, so let's talk about that. So you have a manual interface where you have one off-ice official who is probably not 25 years old, probably doesn't have 20/20 vision, and maybe they're tracking the away team who's from the other conference. And if you want to make it especially difficult, maybe they have on alternate jerseys that make it a bit harder to make out what the numbers are on the back. So just even under the best of circumstances, you're talking about a delay of a couple seconds of, okay, let's mark these players coming on the ice and these players coming off the ice. So nothing precise, and a system that over hundreds and thousands of games, you're bound to have errors in there where wrong player might be marked on the ice and nobody catches it. Or maybe you have a shift, and I've seen this in the past, of there aren't all the players on the ice aren't accounted for. Back when I was starting to consult with an NHL team back in the 2012-13 season, the shortened season, um, the hockey operations person that I dealt with, um, who was, certainly stats friendly. This is something that he pointed out to me is just like time on ice isn't perfect. Shifts aren't perfect. So this is something that, it's not just stats nerds, but hockey people knew this and pointed it out. So it was like certainly something that was worth mention. So all right, so why do we really care about time on ice? So okay, maybe a player's shift is 5 seconds off, or maybe their total ice time is 20 seconds off. Well, it starts to matter with modern statistics. So let's talk about the stats that are called Corsi and Fenwick. So odd names. I've come to think that they're poor names for the stats um, uh, that they are. So Corsi is the strange name for all shot attempts. So you're talking about shots on goal, missed shots, and block shots. So uh, Corsi is going to be all of those added together. Or you could talk about a differential, or you could talk about a percentage between how many shot attempts you have offensively or defensively. And this could be for a team or a player. And Fenwick is the same thing, except you take blocked shots out of the equation. And those strange names are named after Jim Corsi, who was an old-time coach for the Sabres, and Matt Fenwick, who was a writer, a blogger. So the names that are used at the at NHL.com/stats are the ones that I would suggest that people start to use. And this is kind of a long aside here, but Corsi is called SAT, shot attempts, and Fenwick is called USAT, unblocked shot attempts. So here's my public service announcement for suggesting that everybody start to use SAT and USAT instead of Corsi and Fenwick, and SAT percentage and USAT percentage. So anyway, how does time on ice, how do shifts work into that? Well, you need to know who's on the ice to mark down who's getting a plus or minus as far as Corsi or Fenwick, SAT or USAT. So it's the same as essentially as plus minus on a goal, except here we're talking about if a shot attempt is made at your team's end of the ice, it's positive for your team. All the players that you have on the ice for your team should get a bump up in Corsi or SAT. And the same thing with unblocked shot attempts. So if there's an unblocked shot attempt at the bad end of the ice against your own goal, all your players on the ice should get a negative USAT. Their USAT percentage should be going down. So if you don't have the shifts correct, you're going to get stats like this are going to start to go wrong. So for that reason, it's important to try to get time on ice correct. It's not important to know that your guy had 23 minutes and 50 seconds on the ice instead of 23 minutes and 45 seconds on the ice. That's not important. But knowing who's on the ice for certain events is important. And it gets even more important once you start thinking about puck and player tracking stats. So who's on the ice when a zone entry happens, or where are players for when a pass attempt is being made, or so on. But that's for another day. Anyway, so one of the big changes that happened with puck and player tracking to zero fanfare back in January 2021 is time on ice became automated. And I've seen an article as recently as 2024 on The Score, which said that things like time on ice and shots are still tracked by off ice officials. Incorrect. So the fact that time on ice has started to be captured by the chips that are in players' jerseys, you know really accurately who steps on the ice and when. So that's a big improvement that's been made. And bizarrely, although I understand it because I've been on the inside of the NHL, I mean, I understand that there is this kind of mindset. There's a lot of times where the NHL seems to be its worst enemy, where there's an easy win like this, where, like I said, there's team operations people that complained to me about this over 10 years ago, and like easy win to say, hey, time on ice shift, these are dead on right now. Never done. So that's really the message for this video today is the NHL knocked it out of the park with this little thing of getting time on ice exactly correct, getting player shifts exactly correct back in January 2021, over 4 years ago. And nobody heard about it, to the extent that a lot of team people didn't know about it. A lot of media people didn't know about it. I guess you could infer it now, if you see the graphics on TV now that are showing like somebody's shift building up or whatever. But maybe people assume that that is based on inputs by the off-ice officials still, and that's not the case. So anyway, good job, NHL. Way to go for knocking it out of the park in 2021, and now you know about it. See you next time.